The aphids came in the summer of 1987, the way bad things always come to farming country, quietly at first, then all at once. It started with a few curled leaves on Dale Hutchins' soybean field on the east side of Millhaven County, Kentucky. Dale didn't think much of it. Leaves curl in July heat. That's what leaves do. But by the following Thursday, the curling had spread 3 rows deep, and when Dale crouched down and turned a leaf over with his thumb, he saw them. Hundreds of soft-bodied green insects packed so tight they looked like a second skin on the underside of every leaf. He stood up slowly, looked out across his field, and drove straight to Peterson's farm supply on Route 9, without stopping to wash his hands. By Friday morning, word had moved through Millhaven County, the way words always moved there, through the co-op, through the diner on Calhoun Street, through the parking lot of the First Methodist Church, through the back booth at Earl's barbershop, where 4 men talked about weather and crops every single morning, as though the county depended on their conversation, which in some ways it did. The aphids were here, the kind that travelled in colonies, the kind that didn't stop at one field. That was what brought 31 farmers to Peterson's farm supply on a Saturday morning in late July, 1987, standing between the seed displays and the equipment oil, listening to a man named Gary Peterson tell them what they needed to do. Gary Peterson was 38 years old and had inherited the supply store from his father 6 years earlier. He was not a farmer himself, but he knew what farmers needed, or believed he did, which is a different thing entirely. He'd driven down to a distributor conference in Louisville the previous spring and come back with a trunk full of brochures and a new line of synthetic chemical sprays that he'd been waiting for the right moment to introduce. An aphid outbreak moving across the county's soybean and cornfields in the middle of July was, as Gary saw it, the right moment. He had set up a folding table near the back wall and arranged 6 bottles of ChemGuard 40 in a row like soldiers. They were tall bottles, dark green, with a yellow label that had a drawing of a dead insect on it and a lot of small text below that nobody ever read. Gary had also printed a 1-page sheet explaining the application schedule. Spray every 10 days, 3 applications, coat both sides of the leaf surface, add 2 ounces per gallon of water. He explained all of this in a confident, practiced voice. The farmers listened. Some of them had already lost visible portions of their fields. Some of them had driven past Dale Hutchins' east field that morning and seen the damage moving row by row like a slow fire. There were children's college funds tied to those crops. There were equipment loans and seed loans and fuel accounts. Aphids in July, left alone, could hollow out a harvest before August even arrived. By the time Gary finished his presentation, 26 of the 31 farmers in the room had taken bottles off the table or put their names on an order sheet for more. There was relief in the room, the particular relief that comes from having an expert hand you a solution in a bottle and tell you the problem is manageable. They talked among themselves about spraying schedules and tractor calibrations and wind direction, and whether to start on the field edges or the center rows. The problem felt handled. That was worth a great deal on a July morning when the crops were already showing damage. It was while Gary was writing up the second round of order slips that the door to the supply store opened and a man named Earl Sutton walked in. Earl Sutton was 67 years old and had farmed the same 240 acres on the west ridge of Millhaven County for 41 years. He was not tall, but he stood in a way that took up the right amount of space. His hands were the colour of old saddle leather, and his face had been rearranged over the decades by sun and wind into something that looked less like age and more like geology. He wore a work shirt that had been washed so many times The original colour was now a philosophical question. He drove a 1971 Ford F-100 pickup that he'd bought used in 1974 and maintained himself ever since. And he walked into Peterson's farm supply the way he walked everywhere. Unhurried, eyes moving, taking the room in before he committed to being part of it. Several of the farmers nodded at Earl. He was known, the way people are known in small counties. Not famous, not powerful, just deeply familiar, like a landmark. You knew where Earl Sutton's farm was. You knew his truck. You knew he kept his fence lines clean and his equipment in working order. What you didn't necessarily know, unless you'd farmed next to him for more than a decade, was that Earl Sutton had not lost a single soybean crop to insect damage in 31 years. People knew the fact the way they knew a lot of facts about their neighbours, vaguely, without thinking about what it meant. Earl moved to the table and looked at the ChemGuard 40 bottles without touching them. He read the label for a long moment. Gary Peterson, sensing a customer, slid over with a bottle and began explaining the application rate. Earl listened politely. Then he set the bottle back down and said simply that he wouldn't be needing it. Gary blinked. "You've got aphids on the ridge, same as everybody else, Earl. Dale Hutchins Field shares a fence line with your north edge." "I know where Dale's field is," Earl said. "So you're already treated? You used something else?" "No," Earl said. "I'm going to stop at the garden centre over in Carlisle on my way home." There was a brief silence. One of the farmers, a younger man named Tom Breckett, who'd bought his father's land 2 years ago and was still navigating the particular anxiety of new ownership, asked what was in Carlisle that could help with aphids. "Ladybugs," Earl said. The word landed in the room and just sat there. Tom Breckett looked at the man next to him. The man next to him looked at Gary Peterson. Gary Peterson had the expression of someone who has just heard a word in a language he doesn't speak. "Ladybugs," Gary repeated. "That's right." "Earl." Gary put both hands on the table, in the patient way people do when they are about to explain something to someone they've decided is confused. "We are talking about a serious aphid infestation moving across the county. Dale Hutchins has lost 20% visible coverage on his east field in 1 week. These are aphis glycines, soybean aphids, and they reproduce fast enough that a single surviving colony can repopulate a treated field within 2 weeks. This is a chemical application problem. We need something that kills on contact, that has residual protection, that gets into the leaf surface where the insects—" "I know what aphids do," Earl said. He was not unfriendly. He was not argumentative. He said it the way he said most things, as a plain fact, offered once, not repeated. "Then you know ladybugs aren't going to cut it," Gary said, and there was a light ripple of agreement in the room. Tom Breckett laughed a little, then looked embarrassed for laughing. Another farmer, an older man named Phil Cruz, who had been growing corn on the south side of the county for 25 years, shook his head slowly. "Earl, a ladybug eats maybe 50 aphids a day if you're lucky. You're talking about millions of insects across these fields. One ladybug eats between 50 and 300 aphids per day," Earl said, "depending on the species and the food availability. When food is abundant, they eat more, and they lay eggs. The eggs hatch into larvae. The larvae eat even more aphids than the adults do. It compounds." Phil Cruz opened his mouth and closed it. "How many are you buying?" Tom Breckett asked, and his voice had the tone of someone setting up a punchline. $18 worth, Earl said. "About 10,000, the way they price them." The laughter was not mean. It was the laughter of men who were tired and worried about their crops and had just been handed a solution in a bottle and didn't particularly want to have that certainty complicated. It was the laughter of people who needed the world to be simpler than it was. Earl didn't react to it. He looked at the ChemGuard 40 label one more time, noted something to himself that nobody else noticed, and walked back toward the door. "Earl," Gary called after him, not unkindly. "At least take a bottle for the edges, just in case." "I'll be all right," Earl said, and the door closed behind him. He drove the 40 minutes to Carlisle, stopped at Whitfield's garden centre, and bought 6 mesh bags of Hippodamia convergens, convergent lady beetles, the species best suited to open field aphid control in the Mid-South, for $3 a bag. $18 total. He also bought a gallon of water in a clean plastic jug, which he mixed with a tablespoon of sugar and a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar before he got back in the truck. He'd read 30 years ago in an agricultural extension bulletin from the University of Kentucky that a light misting of a diluted sugar solution on the release site encouraged ladybugs to stay rather than disperse immediately. He had tested this himself in the early 1970s and confirmed it worked. He hadn't told anyone because nobody had asked. He got back to his farm at 3 in the afternoon. The sky was white and still, the kind of July sky that holds heat close to the ground. He walked his Northfield boundary first, the one that edged against Dale Hutchins' property, and he read the soil and the leaf surfaces the way a person reads a room they know well. Not searching, just observing. He could see the aphid pressure building on the outer leaves closest to Dale's fence line. They hadn't reached his interior rows yet. He misted the release area lightly with his sugar solution, waited 15 minutes, then opened the first mesh bag near the ground and let the ladybugs walk out on their own schedule. He did not dump them. He did not shake the bag. He opened it and set it down and let them find their own way to the plants, which they did, because that is what ladybugs do when there is food nearby and no reason to flee. He moved along the field edge, releasing clusters every 20 feet, not all 10,000 in one spot, which would cause them to scatter, but distributed along the natural geography of the field's most vulnerable edges. It took him 2 hours. When he was done, he folded the empty bags neatly, put them in his truck, and went inside to eat supper. Across the county, 26 farmers were mixing ChemGuard 40 into their tank sprayers at 2 ounces per gallon. The chemical worked. That part was true and fair to say. Within 4 days of the first application, aphid populations on the treated fields dropped sharply. The farmers walked their rows and felt the relief of seeing clean leaf undersides and uncurled growth. Gary Peterson got a dozen phone calls that week from satisfied customers, and he ordered another case of ChemGuard 40 from his Louisville distributor. What happened next arrived slowly, the way the real consequences of decisions usually do. By the second week of August, the aphid populations in the treated fields had begun to come back. Not fully, the chemical had done what it said, but a resistant subset of the original colonies, the ones that had been at the edges of the spray coverage, had survived. And they reproduced, as Phil Cruz had said, fast. What's more, the ChemGuard 40 had done something else that its label didn't advertise prominently. It had killed the existing population of beneficial insects across the treated fields. The parasitic wasps, the lacewings, the ground beetles, all the things that the natural system of a farm uses to regulate itself, had been wiped clean along with the aphids. The field was now a biological blank slate, and when the aphids came back, they came back into a vacuum. Dale Hutchins did his second application on schedule 10 days after the first. The aphids retreated again. By September, he was into his third application and beginning to do the arithmetic on what this was costing him versus what the late-season crop protection was worth. The numbers were not comfortable. Tom Breckett, who had purchased his father's farm with a bank loan that had a specific yield expectation attached to it, did his math differently, with more urgency. He had applied all 3 rounds of ChemGuard 40 precisely as directed. His fields looked controlled but not clean. There was something happening at the soil level he couldn't quite identify. A flatness to the plant vigour, a slowness to the pod development that his father had never mentioned, and that none of the other treated farmers seemed to be talking about, though Tom suspected this was partly because none of them wanted to be the first to say it. On a Wednesday morning in late August, Tom Breckett drove to the West Ridge. He had driven past Earl Sutton's farm dozens of times in his life and never had a reason to stop. He stopped now. He pulled his truck to the side of the gravel road at the top of the ridge and looked out across Earl's north field from the road, because he didn't feel right about driving in without an invitation. What he saw made him sit with the engine idling for a long time before he put the truck back in drive. Earl Sutton's soybean field was the cleanest field Tom Breckett had ever seen in his life. It was not just healthy. It was the particular, specific, thriving green that soybeans achieve when nothing is competing with them, and the soil biology is intact, and the plants are doing exactly what they evolved to do. The rows were straight and full. The pods were developing ahead of schedule. There was no yellowing, no curl, no evidence of insect pressure anywhere along the northern boundary. The boundary that touched Dale Hutchins' field, where the aphid infestation had originated. Tom sat there for a while. Then he turned into Earl's driveway. Earl was in his equipment shed, sharpening a cultivator blade on a bench grinder, when Tom knocked on the open door frame. Earl shut the grinder off, set the blade down, and listened, while Tom said what he'd come to say, that he'd driven by, that he'd seen the field, that he was struggling with his own situation, and would appreciate understanding what Earl had done differently. Earl wiped his hands on a rag and said, "Come on, I'll show you." They walked the north field boundary together. Earl moved through his rows the way he moved everywhere, slowly, looking at things. He pointed out where the original aphid pressure had been highest when he'd first seen it, near the fence line. He showed Tom the underside of a leaf in that area. It was clean, not chemically clean, biologically clean. There were ladybug casings near the base of several plants, shed larval skins where the beetles had gone through their growth cycle in the field itself. They established a population, Earl said. The adults laid eggs. The larvae hatched out and they ate more aphids than the adults did. By the 3rd week, the aphids couldn't reproduce fast enough to sustain a colony under that kind of predation pressure. The population collapsed on its own. Tom was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since 1974, Earl said. "Before that I tried chemicals twice, once in 68 and once in 71. Both times the aphids came back worse in the 2nd year." "Why worse?" "Because you killed everything," Earl said. He was not accusing. He was explaining because Tom had asked. The chemicals don't know the difference between an aphid and a parasitic wasp. They kill what touches them. So you wipe out the aphids, yes, but you also wipe out every natural predator that was keeping the aphid population in check before you even noticed the aphids. Then the aphids come back, and there's nothing to slow them down until you spray again. You train yourself into a cycle. The chemical company doesn't mind that cycle. Tom thought about the ChemGuard 40 label, the application schedule, 3 rounds, 10 days apart, and felt something settle into place that he wished hadn't. $18, Tom said. $18, Earl confirmed. Tom looked out across the clean, thriving rows. The pods were heavy and even. The soil between the rows had a dark, complex texture that Tom recognized from his father's old fields before the practices had changed. A living soil, full of the invisible community of organisms that made the visible crop possible. My field doesn't look like this. Not yet, Earl said, but it can. Takes a couple of seasons to rebuild what the chemistry disrupts. You stop the spray cycle, you introduce the beneficials, you give the system time to rebalance. It does the rest. They walked back to the equipment shed in the quiet that falls between two men, when something true has just been said, and both of them know it. Earl picked up his cultivator blade and looked at it. Tom stood in the door of the shed with his hat in his hands. I should have listened at Peterson's, Tom said. Earl considered this for a moment. You didn't know, he said. None of you knew. That's not a character problem, Tom. That's just an information problem. Tom nodded slowly. He drove home. He did not do a fourth chemical application. He called Whitfield's Garden Centre in Carlisle that afternoon and asked what they had in stock for late-season release. The word moved through Millhaven County, the way words always moved. Through the co-op, through the feed store, through the diner on Calhoun Street. But this time it moved differently. This time it was a specific story with a specific outcome attached to it, and specific outcomes have a weight that general advice never does. People drove past Earl's West Ridge field and looked at it from the road the way Tom Breckett had. What they saw was not complicated. It was a healthy field in a county full of struggling ones, and the explanation for it was $18 and 10,000 ladybugs and 41 years of paying attention. Dale Hutchins came by in early September, which took more from him than Tom Breckett's visit had taken from Tom. Because Dale was older and had been farming longer and had a harder time arriving at a neighbour's door holding a question he didn't know how to ask. He stood at the edge of Earl's driveway for a moment before Earl saw him from the porch and waved him over. They sat on the porch and talked for an hour. Dale asked the questions that had been building in him since he'd walked his own fields that morning, and tried to reconcile what his eyes were telling him with the money he'd already spent on 3 rounds of ChemGuard 40. He'd done everything right by the book Gary Peterson had given him. His fields were alive. But Earl's fields were thriving, and there was a difference between those two words that Dale could feel in his chest, even if he couldn't have articulated it precisely. Earl answered every question Dale asked. He didn't give him a lecture. He answered what was asked completely, and waited. When Dale asked why he'd never said any of this before, at the co-op, at the feed store, at the county extension meetings, Earl thought about it for a moment and said that people generally don't hear what they haven't decided they need yet. He'd mentioned Ladybugs at Peterson's in July and gotten laughed at. That wasn't the right moment. This September, with the harvest coming and the chemical cycle revealing its costs, this was the right moment. Dale sat with that. What would you have done, he asked, if it hadn't worked? If the ladybugs hadn't stayed, or hadn't been enough? Same thing I did in 1974 when I first tried it and released them wrong, Earl said. I learned what I did wrong and tried again the next season. But I knew the biology was sound. That part I was sure of. How were you sure? Earl was quiet for a moment. In 1956, when he was 16 years old, and his father was still farming the ridge, there had been a bad aphid year. Bad enough that Earl's father had considered selling a portion of the land to cover the loss. Earl had been walking the field one morning when he'd found a section of 2 rows, maybe 30 feet long, that was completely clean, while everything around it was heavily infested. He'd crouched down and spent the better part of an hour figuring out why. What he found was a dense population of convergent lady beetles that had naturally colonized that section. He could see the larval casings, the egg clusters under the leaves, the whole cycle running on its own. 2 rows out of a field of aphid damage, protected by the biology that was already there. He'd shown his father. His father had looked at it for a long time and said, "Nature already knows how to do this. We just have to let it." Earl had not forgotten. That single observation, made when he was 16 years old, crouching in a field in Millhaven County, had shaped everything he did for the next 51 years. He told Dale this. Not as a story, exactly, just as an explanation, because Dale had asked a real question and deserved a real answer. Dale nodded for a long time after Earl stopped talking. Then he said, "I spent $480 on chemical spray this season, Earl." Earl said nothing. "You spent 18. "Yes." "And your field looks better than mine." "Yes." Dale stood up from the porch chair and looked out at the ridge field in the last of the afternoon light. The pods were heavy. The rows were full. The harvest was going to be good. Visibly, obviously, quantifiably good, in a way that Dale's fields, for all the money and effort he'd put into them, were not quite going to match. "Next year," Dale said. "Next year," Earl agreed. Gary Peterson heard the full story eventually, as he heard everything. Through the web of conversation that connected every feed store and diner and church parking lot in Millhaven County. He heard that Tom Breckett had gone to Earl's farm. He heard that Dale Hutchins had gone. He heard that Phil Cruz and 2 other farmers had called Whitfield's Garden Centre in Carlisle about late-season release options, and that Whitfield's had said they'd need to bring in more stock next summer if the demand was going to be what it sounded like. Gary sat with this information for several days before he drove out to the West Ridge himself. He didn't call ahead. He wasn't sure Earl would have been anything but welcoming. But Gary had been present at the moment Earl was laughed at in his own store, and he felt the awkwardness of that in a way that made calling ahead feel dishonest. He just drove out. Earl was checking his combine settings in the equipment shed when Gary pulled in. Gary walked up and Earl looked at him once without surprise, the way he looked at most things, and went back to what he was doing with a wrench. Gary stood there. He had a prepared version of what he wanted to say, something measured and professional, something that acknowledged Earl's results while preserving a certain amount of Gary's own standing. He'd worked on it in the truck, but standing in the actual equipment shed, watching Earl adjust a setting on a machine that was 30 years old, and clearly in perfect working order, the prepared version felt too small for what it was trying to carry. "I shouldn't have let the room laugh," Gary said. "When you told us what you were going to do, I could have said something. I didn't." Earl set the wrench down. He looked at Gary for a moment. "You didn't know what I knew," Earl said. "You sell what the distributors bring you, and you explain it the best way you can. That's your job. You weren't wrong for doing your job. My job didn't serve these farmers as well as $18 of Ladybugs did." Earl picked the wrench back up. He was quiet for a moment, turning something over. Then he said, Start carrying the bags. Whitfields will sell you a wholesale arrangement for the spring. Release information comes with them. You should make sure your customers know how to do the release properly, or the beetles disperse and it doesn't work. That's the part most people get wrong the first time. Gary looked at him. That's it? That's all you're going to say? What else would I say? Earl said. He wasn't being short. He was genuinely asking. The lesson had already been learned. The season was closing. There was a combine to prepare. Gary drove back to the supply store. He called his Louisville distributor that afternoon and asked about beneficial insect suppliers. He also called Whitfield's garden centre in Carlisle and asked about their wholesale pricing. He spent the following 2 weeks putting together a 1-page information sheet on convergent lady beetle release, the sugar misting technique, the distributed release method, the importance of releasing near the ground in the evening rather than midday, the difference between a colony that establishes and one that disperses. He set up a small display near the back of the store. Beside it, he placed a handwritten card that said, "Ask about biological control. Effective, low cost, does not disrupt beneficial insects." He did not put his own name on the card. He thought about putting Earl Sutton's name on it, but decided that was Earl's business, not something to take and display without asking. The harvest that fall told the story in numbers. Earl Sutton's north field, the field that shared a boundary with Dale Hutchins' aphid origin field, the one that had faced the heaviest natural pressure, came in at 47 bushels per acre, which was 4 bushels above the county average for that season and 6 bushels above what his own field had averaged during the 2 years he'd tried chemical control back in the early 1970s. His soil biology tests, which he did himself every 3 years using a county extension kit, showed no disruption to beneficial microorganism populations. The field would go into winter with everything intact. Dale Hutchins' treated fields came in at 41 bushels per acre, below his 5-year average, though not disastrously so. The chemical cost ate into the margin in a way that the yield didn't recover. He sat down with his numbers in October, at the kitchen table he'd sat at for 30 years, and looked at the arithmetic for a long time. Tom Brackett's fields came in somewhere between the two. He had stopped the chemical cycle in late August, which was late enough in the season that the biological rebalancing hadn't had time to complete, but early enough that some natural predator recovery had occurred in his interior rows. His numbers were adequate. He knew they would be better next season, and the season after that, as the soil and the insect ecology rebuilt themselves toward the condition Earl's fields had been in for years. Phil Cruz told the story to his son-in-law in October, sitting at the same table where he'd eaten supper for 30 years, in the blunt, unsentimental way that farmers have of talking about things that turned out differently than expected. His son-in-law was 24 and had just started working a small piece of rented ground outside of town. Phil told him about the meeting at Peterson's, about the laughing, about what Earl had said, and what happened afterward. He told it without editorializing, the way you tell a story where the facts carry all the weight that needs to be carried. "What was it again?" his son-in-law asked. "What exactly did Earl say when the guy from the store tried to explain it to him?" Phil thought back to that Saturday morning in July. The Chem Guard 40 bottles in a row. Gary's explanation. Earl's face, unhurried, reading the label. "He said, 'I know what aphids do,'" Phil told him. "And then he said he was going to go buy ladybugs. And when we laughed, I'm not going to pretend we didn't. He just said, 'I'll be all right,' and walked out the door." His son-in-law was quiet for a moment. And he was. He was, Phil said. He always was. Earl Sutton's farm sat on the West Ridge the same way it had sat there for 41 years. The combine was ready. The fence lines were clean. In the equipment shed, on a shelf above the bench grinder, there was a folded paper receipt from Whitfield's Garden Centre in Carlisle, dated July of 1987, for $18. Earl hadn't put it there deliberately. It had come out of his shirt pocket when he was looking for something else, and he'd set it on the shelf and never moved it. He didn't think of himself as a man who had proven anything. He thought of himself as a man who had paid attention to a 30-foot section of field in 1956, listened to what it was telling him, and never stopped listening since. The county had caught up with him for a season, and now it would go on ahead again in some direction, and he would stay where he was, on the ridge, reading the fields the way he always had. In the spring of 1988, Peterson's farm supply had a display of convergent lady beetle bags near the back wall, with a one-page information sheet on proper release technique. Gary Peterson sold 43 bags in the first 2 weeks of May alone. People came in asking for them by name. A few of them mentioned Earl Sutton. A few of them didn't, because the idea had settled into them as their own by then, which is the way good ideas always travel, until the person using them forgets where they first heard it, and simply calls it common sense. That is the whole journey of knowledge, if you think about it. Someone learns a thing the hard way, holds onto it through the years when no one is interested, and then one bad summer comes, and suddenly everyone needs to know what that person has known all along. The knowledge doesn't change. Only the hunger for it does.